A volley of rifle fire tore through the quiet air over the Kentucky River, and the man they called Bad Tom Baker fell. The one-armed king of Clay County, a figure whispered about with a mix of terror and awe, disappeared into the murky water. History calls it the end of a feud. But was it just a family squabble over a stolen pig or a stray card game? Or was it the assassination of a tyrant who had turned the law into his personal weapon and ruled an entire county through sheer brutal force? Today, we dig past the headlines to find the truth behind Appalachia's most feared family dynasty. To understand the Bakers, you have to understand the land that shaped them. Clay County, Kentucky, after the Civil War, was a world unto itself. Carved by deep, misty valleys the locals call Hollers, it was a place where the modern world's grip was weak. The people here, mostly descendants of tough Scottish-Irish settlers, lived by a code much older than any state constitution. Family wasn't just important, it was everything. Your clan was your nation, your church, and your army, all rolled into one. Life was hard, scraped from thin soil and dense forests. Logging and salt mining were the only real industries, and in a place with so little power wasn't measured in dollars, but in influence. The most coveted prize was the sheriff's badge, because whoever held it didn't just enforce the law, they were the law. They controlled taxes, settled disputes, and decided who prospered and who starved. It was a king's throne in a kingdom of log cabins and dirt roads. This isolated world was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The Civil War had split communities down the middle. Neighbor fought neighbor, and those wounds never truly healed. The Bakers had largely sided with the Union, while many of their future rivals, like the Howards, had fought for the Confederacy. They returned from the war not as countrymen, but as vanquished foes and bitter victors, forced to live side by side in these tight, unforgiving hollers. Every day was a fragile truce. Men worked their land with a rifle never far from reach. They gathered at the county seat of Manchester with pistols tucked in their belts, their eyes constantly scanning for the face of an old enemy. They were proud, stubborn people, steeped in a tradition where an insult to one was an insult to all, a debt that could only be paid in blood. They didn't know it yet, but their way of life was standing on the edge of a cliff. The world of quiet mountain self-reliance was about to be shattered by a feud so brutal it would become a legend. A small grudge, born from this soil steeped in hate, was about to grow into a war that would drench the courthouse steps in red and leave a legacy of fear that would echo for 100 years. History loves a clean starting point, a single gunshot, a stolen kiss, one insult that tips the world into chaos. But in the mountains, feuds rarely have a single beginning. They fester. They grow in the dark like mold, feeding on old wounds and whispered grudges. The Baker-Howard feud was no different. Some old-timers swear it started over a card game when a Baker accused a Howard of cheating, and words gave way to fists, then knives. Others say it was something as simple and as serious as a stolen boar. The truth is, it doesn't matter which spark lit the fuse. The whole county was a powder keg that had been sitting since the Civil War, just waiting for any reason to explode. And the man who struck the match was Thomas Baker, known to history as Bad Tom. He wasn't just another brawler in a long line of them. He was different. There was a cold fire in his eyes, a charisma that drew men to him, and a ruthlessness that made them fear him. He'd lost an arm in a sawmill accident, but this only added to his mythic stature. With one hand, they said, he could handle a rifle better than any two-handed man in the state. He was the living embodiment of his family's pride and their rage, and he didn't just join the simmering conflict, he became its heart. The feud might have remained a series of back-alley brawls and drunken shootouts, if not for one thing: politics. Bad Tom saw that true power wasn't just in the barrel of a gun, but in the sheriff's badge that could legitimize its use. He ran for sheriff, and through a campaign of charm, intimidation, and likely a few backroom deals, he won. This was the point of no return. The law was no longer a neutral force in Clay County. It was now a weapon pointed directly at the heart of the Howard clan and their allies. Suddenly, the game had changed. This was no longer just about family honor. It was about survival. For the Howards, facing a sheriff who was also their sworn enemy, there was no court of appeal, no neutral ground. Their only path was to fight back with the same ferocity. The threats, once muttered in saloons, became open declarations of war. A loaded cartridge might be left on a windowsill, a silent promise of what was to come. A rider might gallop past a Howard cabin in the dead of night, firing a single shot into the darkness, not to kill, but to remind them that they were never safe. The time for talking was over. Under the reign of Bad Tom, the streets of Manchester, the county seat, became a theatre of war. Court days were the most dangerous. The air would grow thick with tension as the armed clans gathered, their eyes locked on each other across the town square. It wasn't a matter of if violence would erupt, but when. And one day, it did, in a way that would be seared into the county's memory forever. As the Howards and their allies stood on the courthouse steps, the world exploded in a deafening roar of gunfire. From concealed positions, the Bakers unleashed a coordinated volley. For a moment, there was only the thunder of rifles and the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke. Then came the screams. Men who had been standing tall moments before crumpled to the ground. The white columns of the courthouse, symbols of law and order, were stained with something other than rain. When the gunsmoke finally cleared and a ringing silence fell, the ground was littered with the fallen. The law hadn't just been broken, it had been executed in broad daylight. But the horror wasn't confined to these public spectacles. The war followed people home. It crept onto their porches in the dead of night, leaving a single bullet on a windowsill, a silent promise. Or worse, a small, crudely carved coffin, a message more chilling than any spoken threat. A family would be sitting down to supper, and a shot would ring out from the darkness, shattering a window pane. The bullet wasn't meant to hit anyone. It was meant to shatter their peace, to remind them that they were never safe, to exhaust their nerves until they broke. The mountains, once a source of comfort, became an enemy. Every bend in the road, every dense patch of woods, could be hiding an ambush. The Bakers knew these hills like the back of their one remaining hand. They would strike from the trees like ghosts and melt back into the forest, leaving behind only chaos and fear. Travel between Hollers became a life-or-death gamble. Perhaps the darkest tale whispered about Bad Tom was the one about his own cousin. The story goes that the man showed a moment of weakness, a flicker of cowardice in the face of the enemy. For Bad Tom, this was a betrayal worse than any other. He summoned the man to the family home, and as the cousin stood on the doorstep, a single shot echoed through the holler. It was a message to everyone, friend and foe alike. In the Baker clan, loyalty was absolute, and the price for breaking the code was paid on the spot, without hesitation. After the smoke cleared from the courthouse steps, a new kind of silence fell over Clay County. It wasn't peace, it was the suffocating quiet of absolute fear. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered, and the streets of Manchester emptied as if a plague had swept through. The only ones who moved freely were the Bakers and their allies, who walked with the swagger of conquering heroes. The law, which had bled out on the town square, was now whatever Bad Tom Baker said it was. For the survivors of the Howard clan, grief quickly hardened into a cold, unbending resolve. They carried their dead back to their family plots in the quiet Hollers, but they weren't just burying their kin. They were burying any hope of conventional justice. To appeal to Sheriff Baker to investigate a crime committed by the Bakers was not just futile, it was a death sentence. They knew then that the war would not be won in a courtroom or on a ballot. It would only end when Bad Tom Baker was in the ground. The fear was a poison that seeped into every corner of life. Neighbors who had known each other for generations stopped speaking, their eyes averting in the street lest a friendly word be misinterpreted as taking a side. Business ground to a halt. The mountains that had once been a sanctuary became a prison, and the legend of Bad Tom grew with every whispered story. People said he couldn't be killed, that he'd made a deal with the devil for his one-armed marksmanship. In the flickering firelight of their cabins, people began to believe that he wasn't a man at all, but a spirit of vengeance sent to punish the county for its sins. But the gunshots in Manchester echoed far beyond the hills of Clay County. Newspapers in Frankfurt and Louisville began to run sensational stories about bloody Clay, painting it as a savage land ruled by a one-armed tyrant. The state government, long content to let the mountain counties manage their own affairs, could no longer ignore the anarchy. The governor was embarrassed. Rewards were quietly offered for information, and the first whispers of sending in the state militia began to circulate. The outside world was finally starting to peer into the heart of darkness that Clay County had become. This external pressure, combined with the desperation of his enemies, sealed Bad Tom's fate. His opponents realized they couldn't outfight him, and they couldn't outvote him. They had only one option left. In secret meetings, deep in the woods, a plan was forged. It wouldn't be a fair fight, because a fair fight with Tom Baker was one you lost. It would be an ambush. They began to watch his movements, learning his routines, waiting for the perfect moment to cut the head off the snake and end his bloody reign for good. With Bad Tom Baker's body lost to the Kentucky River, you might think the story was over, but it wasn't. His death wasn't an act of law, it was an assassination. And now, the law of men finally came to Clay County. The state, embarrassed and angry, sent in troops and prosecutors. The war of ambushes and shootouts was over. The war of witness stands and gavels was about to begin. The courthouse, once a battlefield, was now to be a place of judgment. The trials that followed were a spectacle, a clash of two entirely different worlds. Armed state militiamen stood guard, their faces grim, watching a crowd that was divided by an invisible line of hatred. On one side sat the remaining Bakers, on the other, the Howards and their allies. In the middle were the city lawyers in their pressed suits, trying to apply abstract legal principles to a conflict fueled by generations of raw, personal vengeance. For the mountain folk packed into the gallery, it was a strange and foreign circus, where truth seemed less important than procedure. The men in the dock were a study in defiance. Whether Baker or Howard, they showed little remorse. They sat with a stoic dignity, their faces carved from the same hard Appalachian rock as their homes. To them, this wasn't a trial for murder. It was a trial of survival. They looked at the judge and the jury, not with the eyes of guilty men, but with the weary gaze of soldiers who had fought a long and brutal war, only to be judged by outsiders who had never spent a single night in the trenches. They didn't plead for mercy, because mercy wasn't a currency they understood. The verdicts, when they came, were as messy and complicated as the feud itself. Some men were convicted, sent away to rot in a Frankfurt prison, becoming martyrs to their families. Others, even those known to have pulled a trigger, were acquitted. Witnesses suddenly couldn't remember faces. Juries of local men who had to live in these hollers long after the judge went home delivered verdicts that defied the evidence. The law came to Clay County, but it found that the old codes of silence and clan loyalty were stronger than any prosecutor's argument. In the end, the state declared the feud officially over. The newspapers reported that justice had been served. But was it? For the people who lived it, the court's justice felt hollow. It didn't bring back the dead. For every man sent to prison, another known killer walked free. The trials didn't bring closure. They just forced the hatred underground, where it would simmer for another generation. The law of men had imposed a fragile peace, but the justice of the mountains, a justice of blood for blood, was left unfinished, an angry ghost that would haunt the Hollers for years to come. The trials ended, the troops went home, and a quiet, exhausted peace settled over Clay County. The Baker Dynasty, once a force that could command a private army and bend the law to its will, crumbled. Without the iron fist of Bad Tom to hold it together, the clans scattered like ashes in the wind. Some of his sons and lieutenants went to prison. Others moved away, changing their names to escape the shadow of their family's bloody reputation. The name that once inspired terror now became a quiet mark of a past best left buried. But the past is never truly buried in these mountains. It just sleeps. If you go to Manchester today, you'll see a modern town. The courthouse that once ran with blood has likely been renovated, its columns scrubbed clean. But if you look closely, the real story is still there. It's in the small, forgotten family cemeteries hidden up in the Hollers, where weathered headstones bear the names of young men who didn't die of old age. The dates tell a silent story of a war that history books barely mention. The land itself seems to hold the memory. And if you find an old man sitting on his porch and you ask him about the feuds, you'll see a change in his eyes. The stories are still told, not as history, but as cautionary tales whispered on long winter nights. They'll tell you about Bad Tom, the one-armed king, and how he ruled this county with fear. The official records are sparse, but the oral history, passed down from grandfather to grandson, is rich and terrifying. The name Baker is no longer a threat. It's a legend, a ghost that haunts the local memory. Most of the cars that drive the winding roads of Clay County are just passing through, their drivers unaware of the ghosts that linger in the shade of the trees. But the mountains remember everything. They remember the gun smoke and the screams. The Kentucky River still flows, the same dark water that swallowed the body of Bad Tom Baker, taking his secrets with him. The feud is over, but its echo remains, a permanent part of the landscape, a whisper in the Appalachian wind. So we return to where we began, with the body of Bad Tom Baker sinking into the Kentucky River. Was his story just another bloody chapter in a family feud, born from a stolen pig or a crooked card game? The truth is, it was so much more than that. It was the story of how a man, forged in the fires of isolation and clan warfare, took the ancient mountain code of honor and twisted it into a crown. He wasn't just a feudist, he was a king, and Clay County was his brutal, bloody kingdom. His death wasn't just an act of revenge, it was a regicide, the only way his subjects knew to end a tyrant's reign. The story of the Baker dynasty is a dark mirror held up to the heart of Appalachia. It's a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people, their fierce loyalty, their stubborn pride, and their refusal to bow to any authority but their own. But it's also a terrifying lesson in what happens when that spirit is poisoned by poverty and old hatreds. It shows us how thin the line is between a man protecting his family and a man destroying his community, between justice and vengeance. This isn't just a tale of outlaws and shootouts, it's a story about a forgotten America, a world where the only law that mattered was the law of blood. The men who fought and died in these hills weren't simple villains. They were complex, desperate men, living by the only code they'd ever been taught. Their legacy is a reminder that the past is never as clean or simple as the history books would have us believe. And that is why we must keep these stories alive, pulled from the shadows of the misty Hollers. Because they remind us of the fire and the blood that shaped this land, and of the ghosts who still walk here. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.